Hi, we're on live, and this is Dive into Worldbuilding. I'm Juliet Wade, and we're joined today by a host of hissing snakes who are speaking in an auditory language. So we're just going to mute those. and Reggie, just unmute when you have something to say. But I thought I'd start my hangout with a joke. Anyway, because poor Reggie's been trying to deal with her hissing snakes here for a while. So today's topic is non-auditory languages. This should be fun. We'll see how we go. So okay, auditory languages are really popular. I think that's the way to kind of start this topic. Like, auditory languages are really popular. They speak them all over the world, and in, you know, when you look at fiction, they speak them all kinds of places because frankly, we're so accustomed to auditory language that it's much easier for us to conceptualize things if people are speaking in auditory language. So we're used to that. However, that's not the only option. I'm going to actually start with a sort of a borderline case. A borderline case, which is the case of Dolphin Language. And I only call it a borderline case because it is auditory, but it's not solely language, right? It's their perception system for reality as well as a language channel. And I'm going to introduce you to this this term called channel, which you may have heard me use before. And channel basically means the avenue that you use to communicate. So auditory is a channel, okay? Olfactory would be a channel. I'm not sure where the term came from, but it does some useful things. I mean, it indicates, for example, that if you're on the wrong channel, you're not going to be getting the message. Right?
Do they correspond one-to-one with the 5 sentences?
Well,
senses.
For any sense, you can basically think of a way to make it language, right? So we are going to do that, right? So starting with the earth, because, you know, the earth is a great source for inspiration. I think we really have to start with sign. Now, I wish I were a super great sign person because it's just one of those things. I always want to know all the languages. And I'm a very slow finger speller. And one of the things that's important to know about sign language is that it is not English. American Sign Language, okay, so first of all, there are lots of sign languages, all right? ASL, American Sign Language, is just one. Some people in the US use what's called SCE, Signed Exact English, all right? And so that is actually like a translation of English into sign form, right? But ASL, American Sign Language, is actually a different language, and it has its own structure, its own grammar, and all that kind of thing. And I'll get into that in a second. But if you think about it, there's no reason for people to have the same sign language all across the world. We have this idea that signs, that visual things, are somehow more iconic than auditory language. And really, yes and no. Iconicity is an interesting question because when you look at, say, for example, written languages, and you look back at the history of writing, initially, a lot of the characters that we use for writing were originally drawings of things. Essentially, that they were very iconic at the beginning, and then they evolved into shorthand over time and became less iconic, okay? So signs are very similar in that respect, that that for many sign languages have a level of iconicity, right?
But even if there's
unless you know the history of the language, unless you know what it's supposed to be iconic for, you don't necessarily know, right?
So even if they all started with the same sign for a word, they would diverge just like a auditory language.
Well, so you can start with something, you know, a sign could possibly over its history start being very iconic and indicative of something in particular, right? I mean, you know, like in, I think this is in, that's pretty iconic, right? But there are a lot of ways to demonstrate the idea of in. I mean, you could do in several ways, right? I mean, just because something is iconic doesn't mean it's the only way to be iconic. Okay? So if you look through the world, there's Japanese Sign Language, there's French Sign Language, there's American Sign Language. There are all kinds of sign languages, including the language that Sarah brought today, which is a Nicaraguan sign language that was actually developed spontaneously in the 1970s and 1980s. So not all of these are super, super old, right? And languages can form spontaneously, which is actually kind of cool.
Amazing.
Isn't it cool?
Yes.
Yes, but so all throughout the world, you have different sign languages, and they're not mutually intelligible. And it's funny that you have to say that, but frankly, I wasn't aware of it for a long time because I had these ideas. Well, you know, you kind of have these ideas about the iconicity of signs, right? And then, of course, you get into the process of actually learning the language, and you go, oh, well, you know, okay, I see there's something iconic about it, but not necessarily, and some of them are more and some of them are less, right?
Iconicity is cultural.
Right.
The same way that language, spoken languages.
Yep, good point, Morgan. And localized, just, you know, yeah. Yeah. All right, so yeah, so there's that. But so sign language is let's see. The interesting thing that I did in fiction with a sign language, and now I've spoken with a number of people who have worked in fiction with sign languages, okay? And basically, it's very tricky to work with sign language in fiction. Why? Well, because you can't describe every sign, right? And how do you then render it in English text, right? I mean, if you were to do it in a video scenario, that, you know, you could actually demonstrate, you could create a sign language and you could actually have people use it, but you would still have to translate it because anyway, but when you're working in a story, like in a fictional story, then you're going to have to find some kind of compromise to render your sign language and what it's saying, right? And to indicate that a person is signing versus not signing. And yeah, so those are really tricky questions. There is not just one answer for this. Let me look in the, I'm seeing a conversation in the sidebar here. So colloquialisms and inside jokes. Okay, so language change applies to all languages. Doesn't matter what kind they are. Doesn't matter what channel they're on. Language constantly changes through use. That's just one of the features of language. And slang arises and all this kind of stuff. So it's going to arise in sign language just in the same way that it arises in auditory language. And through inside jokes or funny speech / signing errors, or, you know, language change is a thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, and that's universal to languages, which is, you know, change is pretty much universal universal to everything. But anyway, okay. So yes, okay. So in fact, I'm glad that you brought up the semiotics discussion that we had a few weeks ago, Morgan, because I was just thinking of it a minute ago and I forgot to let it out of my mouth, which is, and it connects back to this question of iconicity, right? We have visual language, right? And we have these icons that mean particular things, but they don't stay the same over time. And they aren't universal to all world cultures. So yeah, so the semiotics that you find, because we were talking about how to develop a semiotics for a secondary world, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is similar, right? Because semiotics is not going to be the same between two different cultural groups.
Right.
You know, and it can be shared. It can certainly be shared, right? So, you know, Renaissance paintings. A lot of people are going to get that a general feel from a Renaissance painting because that is in the past of a lot of different groups, right? But if you look at the iconicity in Renaissance European painting and you look at the same era in China, you're going to see different things. So, and then Reggie was asking about language or head nodding gestures. Okay, so this is getting into gesture a little bit. And gesture is not the same thing as sign language, but that's cool. It is a non-auditory sort of extra, you know, like a peripheral, right? It's an extra layer of our verbal communication. And I've mentioned bunches of things about it. The thing that I think I've mentioned is that this is come here in Japanese. And for us, this is go away. So there's actually a very slight difference between the two. And if you get them wrong, you can actually go down a street and get lost. All somebody's like, no, come on over here. But yeah, so that stuff changes and it's different between different cultures. So, okay, so let's see. One thing I wanted to do before I move on from sign language is talk about what grammar is. Okay, you guys know what grammar is?
Let's hear it from the linguist.
Okay. Well, so actually, this is from okay. You're going to get this from a linguist, but this is not necessarily what a linguist would tell you. But basically, okay. So, so why grammar exists is to help us step away from context. Okay. If everything about your context is shared, you can communicate really effectively with single words, like a doctor and a nurse standing over a patient in the operating room and the doctor says scalpel. And everybody knows not only why he's saying it, but who he's saying it to, who is expected to act, and how that person is expected to act, right? So you don't need grammar in that situation because the entire context is known and shared, right? So grammar actually, in a sense, recreates context in an abstract way so that people can understand something that happened when it's not right in front of them and all around them at this time.
That is fascinating. I did not know that.
Yeah, yeah. So for example, why does past tense exist? Well, because you don't want to say something and have the person look around and go, well, I don't see that happening right now. What? Right? And so past tense is one way to put a marker on what you're saying to indicate, well, this is something that happened in the past, right? And basically, so there are these somewhat arbitrary markers that we put on things to help the person that we're talking to understand whether it was about them or whether it was about somebody else that we interacted with, right? There are also markers that we put on that indicate, for example, whether we're trying to send a message to the other person in an authoritative way or in a humble way, right? So grammar has lots and lots of complexity, but what it's trying to do, like its fundamental function, is helping us to understand lost aspects of context because we don't share all of our life experiences. Okay? So, so it exists in lots of languages. It takes different forms in different languages, right? You know, what we tend to do is we tend to put words in order. That's a form of grammar. We tend to stick endings on them, right? We tend to use parts. We've got parts of speech, right, that sort of organize the world for us. Categorization is one of the critical things that language does, right? Mm-hmm. And so a non-auditory language is going to have all of these functions. But it's going to do them in different ways, right? And there are some things that auditory languages are really good at, like onomatopoeia. You know, that's like a thing that auditory languages seems really well suited to do, right? Yeah. But conveying manner is a thing that sign language is really well suited to do. Right?
Yes,
we use adverbs to convey manner, right? How it was done. But there are ways that you sign things differently to indicate the way that it was done that convey manner in this really dramatic and organically natural way, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to go any further with describing the grammar of ASL because I don't know enough about it to be really authoritative here. But let me just tell you that it can do some cool things. Conveying manner is one of them. You can actually locate a topic or a person in a place within your signing field and then refer back to that spot to have people bring up that person or thing. So like she was doing this over here, I was doing this over here. You can actually kind of you can kind of locate people almost like pronouns, right? Within your signing space so that you can refer back to them, which is kind of it's a cool thing. There are many cool things, and this is one of the reasons why I wish I could spend more time with ASL, and I probably should make some time to do that. But those are the two things I wanted to point out, the manner thing and then location in space. Okay, so let's say, for example, that you wanted to create a sign language that was completely new and you for a fictional piece of work. And there was one like that in my story that came out this year, which was Language of the Silent. And it was a very complicated scenario where my protagonist lost her hearing and then ended up stumbling upon a group of people who had invented a sign language, and they had invented it much like the kids in Nicaragua that Sarah was describing. Okay, and the reason that they had invented it was in order to have a secret language that they could use to free themselves from people who had enslaved them. So I was basing it on sign languages, and I was also basing it on, for example, you know, Hebrew, which was revived as a language for the Jewish people and to try to unify the community. And so there were some very key social things about the language and functions that it had that it then was able to spread throughout the Jewish diaspora, for example. And it was a little bit of a language of rebellion kind of thing.
Definitely.
So I was kind of modeling on that. I was like, oh, that's a really interesting concept, that you would pick a language, in this case, a language that had been considered dead, and then it was revived in order to create a unified identity for a group of people. And that was very, very cool.
It is.
So that was what I was trying to emulate with the sign language.
Like a caveat to dead, I would call it more ossified because it was still studied for scholarly purposes. So
well, I mean, Latin is still studied for scholarly purposes, and everybody calls it dead. So yeah. I totally get your point.
Like it's Sumerian or something. It's not
probably there were people speaking it because, frankly, I know people who speak Latin just because it's fun, right?
Okay.
But it's less of a parent to child, my community speaks this language thing.
Yeah. Okay.
There may have been, I don't know. I mean, because I haven't done enough research to know whether there were pockets of Hebrew speakers in the world somewhere at the point when it was chosen as to be revived. But the number of speakers was vanishingly small. Let's just say that. Okay.
Agreed.
So let's see. I'm behind on my notes. I'm passionate about this topic.
Cool topic.
Anyway, so that was something I did with sign language. But one of the things that was actually kind of important was that my protagonist didn't understand the sign language. She didn't just suddenly. She was deafened for whatever reason, and she was a linguist, and she didn't just kind of bang fall in and like, oh yeah, I get this. No, okay, because that would have been really annoying, right? And too coincidental, and like that's too easy. No, I don't think so, right?
Yeah.
So I took away all of her magic tools for learning languages quickly, and I gave her back a little bit of an advantage by having the sign language be structurally sort of related to the auditory language that she had studied on the way to the planet, but so I was manipulating that a little bit. But over the course of the story, she did not understand the signs. She would just describe them in a couple of places. And then she wasn't able to hear any kind of auditory language in the story, which made, she had to communicate by tablet occasionally. And yeah, so it was very interesting as an author to manage that. And Sheila Finch, actually my co-author, helped me a lot with making that work and making it come off smoothly and stuff like that. So anyway, whenever you get non-auditory, you run into this because I guess you could say readers, as I said at the beginning, we're very used to auditory language. So readers are very used to auditory language. And it's like a base assumption, right?
Definitely.
That people will be working with auditory language. And so if you are not very, very attentive about marking it as non-auditory, then they will just assume that things you write as messages are auditory, right? So, all right, so let's move beyond sign a little bit. Visual languages. So I've seen color-based languages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that on these ones.
Cephalopod style, skin color change languages.
I read one book where there was kind of a language of the flowers, which obviously is not a full language, but an indication of meaning through smells.
Yeah.
Which was a plot point. It was amazing. Sorry.
Well, I brought up before we started in a video game a language of pheromones used by a non-human species. And one of the interesting things in the game is an aside. Someone who was going to put on a production of Hamlet with this species as the actors. Very, very different. Now, this species doesn't have facial expressions that can be read by humans, so they preface their English interactions, their spoken interactions, with the word describing their feeling. Regretfully, whatever the words were. And the thing that the producer is looking forward to is giving humans the chance to judge Hamlet by his deeds and not his emotions, which I thought was interesting. But it's very it's very different, because pheromones communicate in it's a completely different way.
Yeah, so let's talk about what olfactory language does.
Real quick, that production lasted 14 hours according to the next game.
Are you okay, Morgan?
Sorry. I'm sorry, I love that series. 14 hours.
Poor Morgan is now in stitches. Anyway, all right, so I'm glad that Morgan is breathing. All right, so the olfactory language is not going to be, because it's on a different channel, it has some limitations. Like, okay, so what are the features of auditory language? One of them is that auditory language is strung out over time, right?
In a sense, you could kind of do that with an olfactory thing, but it would be layers, and you would lose meaning as you went in a different manner.
Right. So auditory, you have to sit there and be a captive audience, because you have to wait to hear the rest of the message. And even though our brains are really good at reconstructing what's coming and anticipating, there's still a time factor that's very, very limiting, right? With visual language, less so, right? Because all of it is kind of like writing, at least, is concurrent, right? You can have a whole page of writing. This is why I transcribe my Hangout, right? Because we have this great discussion. It takes an hour, but I don't want everybody who wants to partake of it have to sit here and watch us auditorily chit chat for an hour, right? I can summarize it and put it on a page, and people can run their eyes over it, and they can be freed from the time limitations of auditory language. Okay?
You can read faster or slower. Different people read at different
and
speeds.
You can skip across bits, or
right.
Yeah, so
right.
You're less held back by the time constraints. Yeah. I think that's the same with visual language to a certain extent. Obviously, if you're signing, it's also going to take time, but there may be ways that language will compress, depending on, for example, you can sign your manner and your verb at the same time, right? So that compresses it in some ways, if that makes sense. So I imagine that if you had some kind of visual, skin color thing, that, for example, you could indicate your emotional state with the color of your skin, and then be more specific with certain kinds of things like pattern, right? So some things can be concurrent that can't be concurrent when you have to do speech sounds, right?
So with with a language like the bioluminescence or the color changes in skin, you might have, if you have got that, you might have a finer sense of color, so that where we might see 4 or 5 different greens, I know there are lots more.
Yes, we would
species
they would
communicating that way.
Yeah.
Right. Might see, 500
the
different
visual
shades.
spectrum might be much broader too.
That's true.
Yeah.
If you're going like up and down.
Well, actually, we have things like that actually in with our auditory languages, because when you put a name on something, it forces you to pay attention to it and categorize it, right? And so Russian, for example, has more words for the color blue. And so Russian speakers are actually very good at distinguishing fine gradations of the color blue, because they have to focus on it and figure out how to tell the difference between them, or they won't be able to speak the language right. So this is something that Sarah was kind of implying earlier. The way that we categorize in our language does affect the way that we categorize and the way we cognitively think about things, but the way that it happens is actually very subtle. And so if you were not to have language at all, it's not that you would fail to be able to pay attention to things, but the way that you paid attention to things and the way that you thought about objects and all kinds of categories around you would not match the way that those categories work for a language speaker, right? I would recommend the story of Temple Grandin if you want to learn about cognition without language, because she has lots of thoughts on that. And you can have sophisticated cognition without language. But language does specific things. It's almost like, it's like that a person without language just doesn't categorize the way that you would, because the categories won't match. And that's actually a really big problem. I mean, all you have to do is look at Anne Leckie's Presger, and you can see how category mismatch can really be a problem. So all right. I'm seeing, so there's more going on in the sidebar about olfactory language. Yes, olfactory language has layers over time. It absolutely does. And actually, so let's, as a channel, it's really good at indicating when something happened, right? There's your past tense, right? So that you could actually walk up to a stick that had been marked in various ways, and you would be able to sort of read the book of what had happened near this stick for the last, as long as the scent pattern lasts. Right?
I don't think that would be past tense though, because otherwise, how would you indicate future tense if you use the actual age for the tense?
Well, so languages do so effectively when you're talking about grammar, right? When you're talking about divorcing from context, you basically use the tools that you can in whatever way that works best, right? So if there is no future tense, maybe there is no future tense, but there's some other way of marking it. I was talking about past tense, but Chinese, for example, does not have past tense. Yeah. And you're like, well, oh my gosh, like what do they do if it's in the past? Well, they say yesterday or 3 hours ago. Like they mark it with a phrase. And
like 3 hours ago, we are going to the dentist or something.
Right. And so there are many ways to solve these linguistic problems, right? So I'm sure there would be some hack.
Yeah, if you actually were capable of perceiving an olfactory language, you would have that knowledge
Right, and you have the ability to alter the scent and aspects of the scent. Say, for example, that you had a scent and it had a bunch of different chemicals as part of it. One of the things that you could do is you could influence how much of one chemical versus another chemical was being used. And that could be the alteration that allows you to create grammar, for example. Now, of course, I'm thinking in grammar terms because I'm human, and there you are.
And that's what we have.
Grammar would probably not be conceptualized in the same way, but at the same time, without completely going off and saying, well, there are things that people will want to communicate that, okay, yes, there may be alien things that people want to communicate that have nothing to do with what we comprehend, and that is always a problem, right? But our stories tend to be about human things and human-like feelings because those are what people relate to. And we can take ourselves away from that in some directions, but if we completely lose it, nobody's gonna care about the story, right? So these are the challenges. But maybe, yeah. To create, so I'm going, instead of saying to create grammar, to create nuance, right? You have to have something that changes. We change the form of the vibration by messing around with it with our vocal apparatus, right? And if you were having an olfactory language, you would have to mess around with the signal somehow, change aspects of it, in order to communicate and mark differences and that kind of thing. Okay, so I'm sure that could be done. And that would be one way of doing it. I'm not going to say that's the only way of doing it because there are all kinds of ways to solve linguistic problems. Okay, so you guys are just chit-chatty today.
Well, there's so many things to say about
Okay, olfactory language would have layers over time. Olfactory receptors would not necessarily be through breathing. No, that's true. You could have olfactory sensors on your knees. Some insects do. And, yep, school for cephalopods. I want to see you write a story about a school for cephalopods, Chase.
And the pheromones aren't just detected, they're not just an olfactory language either. So it is more than 5 senses. There's the other
I think
senses.
Moths haven't even gone on to tactile. Tactile language, I mean, so Helen Keller used a tactile version of English, right? Because she had a couple of her channels shut down. So she ended up using a tactile, you know, like finger spelling on your hand, tactile version of English. There's tons of opportunity for tactile communication. I mean, we use tactile communication. So like, let's keep in mind here that when it comes to communication, as humans, we use all of the above, right? We use visual, we use gestural, we use tactile, we use all kinds of communication. But the most complex one that has the largest grammatical and informational load for a great many of us is the auditory channel. But let's not pretend that we're not using our other channels, right? It's just that the kinds of things that are communicated using the tactile channel are different from the kinds of things that are communicated using the auditory channel, right? And it's great that we use all the channels because, in fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm going to get to what you were saying, Morgan, about disability. It can affect our ability to use any language, yes. You could have a problem that makes it hard for you to sign. You could have a skin condition. This is what you said, making
No.
it difficult for you to create colors. Yes, all of that. And so what we do is we alternate. We use different channels depending on what we're most easily able to use. I think it would be fascinating to see a story where, in fact, everybody communicates via skin color, and a small cephalopod invents an auditory language because it's not able to communicate via colors properly. Go for it, Morgan. Just do that for me. I think that's fascinating. It does bring me to the question, though, of it takes me back to deafness, because deafness is complex, and I want to okay, so in some ways you say, well, okay, you have a disability, right? What we call, you know, one of your channels is not functioning properly, and so you have to use a different one to communicate. Fine, no problem. But remember that anytime you have language, you have culture, and you have community, and you have something that is larger than just disability, right? So deafness is not just a disability, it's also a speech community and a culture, right? And so that's one of the complications of deafness treatments like cochlear implants and stuff like that, because it is, in one view, restoring a channel that can then be used for language. But anytime you have two competing language forms, as we see in bilingualism, right? Even in the auditory, there is conflict between cultures and languages, right? And kids who grow up with their parents speaking one language but feel great pressure to speak English. That happens in the US all the time. So the deaf community, in many people within the deaf community, feel like their community is threatened by the idea of a cochlear implant, because restoring that channel puts their language and their cultural community in competition with another one that it wouldn't ordinarily be in competition with, right? And that's a fascinating issue in and of itself. Then you can find a lot of videos and articles about it if you look for it. Too much to write down.
I think sometimes there is an assumption that if you are unable to use one of the other channels, facial
Right.
expression, for example, you are incapable of having the feelings
Yes.
that are expressed with facial expressions.
Uh-huh.
You know, that just because you can't say it, you don't know it, you're not feeling it, you're not understanding it, you're not seeing it in others.
Right. And I think you're right. So we have this rich inner life, right? And our ability to translate that rich inner life into a communicative format differs from person to person, right? But it's interesting how easy it is for us to conclude that just because this channel is not working, somehow that rich inner life doesn't exist, right? It's also a problem even when you're not dealing with channel difficulties, right? Even when you're dealing just with language difficulties, that same kind of thing can occur. You know, that people who can't speak a language tend to be treated like they're less intelligent, right? That they don't have they tend to get treated like they don't have full cognitive faculties because their language ability is limited. When in fact, you know, I mean, so it's a huge cultural thing. For example, when somebody comes to this country from another country and in their original language, they are a doctor, you know, with all these sort of certifications, and in the new language, they lose all that and end up in a either a, you know, for example, a menial job, or just saying, you know what, I give up. I'm going to be a house person caring for the family or whatever it is, because the language barrier has reduced their ability to communicate everything that they have within them, right? Yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, there was I had a friend when I was studying in Japan, and she was Japanese American, right? And she was a beginner in Japanese, and people would treat her as though she were mentally disabled. And I was just like, I mean, because it's hard, right? When you're going to another country and you're learning another language, and you get treated differently, but you get treated like a language learner, right? Except that she didn't look like she should be a language learner, right? And for whatever reason, her American mannerisms and her American way of presenting herself physically wasn't enough for people to say, oh, wait, this person's a foreigner, right? Mm-hmm. So she, you know, we don't think of ourselves as language learners as having the benefit of the doubt, right? Mm-hmm. But in a way we do, because people know what a language learner is. If you weren't being seen as a language learner, then the judgment might be even more severe. And that was kind of depressing. You know, I wanted to mention one more thing that, because this is a big topic, and we're just bumping up against the end of our time, and maybe we'll go over by 5 minutes or so. You don't have to be confined to the 5 senses that we know when you're working in fiction, okay? I invented a sense for my story, The Liars, and I made it a language channel, okay? So in The Liars, the sense that I invented was a magnetic sense, okay? And the aliens that I was using had the ability to detect magnetic fields and fluctuations in those magnetic fields, and also to create fluctuations in magnetic fields, right? And so they were able to use that as a language channel, okay? Now, in this story, it was not their only language channel, because remember, we are communicating on all channels, okay? They also had an auditory language. And the auditory language worked in parallel with the magnetic aspects of the language. And so effectively what the key was that all of the emotional and judgmental aspects of the language were conveyed on the magnetic channel, which meant that their language appeared impoverished to somebody who expected a fully fledged auditory language, right? And so when humans came to the planet, they assumed that these creatures were not fully fledged linguistically, and by implication, that there were some issues with them cognitively, right? But it turned out that wasn't actually what was going on, but there was this entire channel that humans just couldn't perceive that was getting a significant language load, and they just weren't able to grasp that. Okay? And it led to, there were a bunch of other things going on culturally and whatever. But one of the things that I wanted to do when I wrote the story was I was like, you know, I'm tired of these science fiction stories where humans end up on a planet and they say, oh yes, you know, the local natives only have 83 words. Oh, their language is so simple, blah, 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 right? And it's just so condescending, it drove me crazy. So I was like, okay, yeah, all right, let's make a place where their language is really simple in our perception. But yeah, we have it all wrong, because I love doing that. I love putting people into a situation where they think they know what's going on and really they don't. Right? Yes, I know this language. No, you don't. Yeah. So, yeah. So think about it, right? That was a magnetic channel. Think about what other kinds of channels there might be. I mean, you could have a facial tic language where a species just has much better control over their facial muscles than we do.
That would look very strange to a human. I approve.
That would be really weird, wouldn't it be? It would be like, that would be so funny, because like humans would just completely flip out. Because they expect certain types of facial expressions, right? And anyway, like, I mean, there's so many options out there.
Also, you think about switching nonverbal forms to other channels. Like in your facial tic thing, they're speaking through their face, and maybe they make moaning sounds to communicate what we would consider facial expressions. Now that would really freak the humans out.
Right. Yes. So I like what you're saying there, which is don't just think about one channel to change, right? Think about just juggling it around a little bit, and maybe their moans are how they communicate their emotions, right? Because we can tend to communicate our emotions through our face.
You have to recognize first that there are other channels than auditory, and then you have to recognize how important those channels are.
Right.
Because if you think that the magnetic sense is a secondary thing and not just as important in communication as the auditory language, you're still not gonna get it. You're not gonna get everything.
Right. And because I mean, it's like you have an array of possible channels, right? And one of them is the most complexity. But then you can mix that up. You could sort of rotate your model and you could have even all the same channels that we have, just use them differently, right? Or you could have an auditory language that was done with hand clapping and accompanied by facial expressions that conveyed grammar. I mean, there are so many options here. This is definitely a world building topic, because I mean, so I guess the question becomes, like, we're going to end up being outsiders to a lot of those languages in our stories, because what's the face for an exclamation point? Yeah, but you know what's funny though? Japanese actually does exclamation points with grammar, right? So really, the way that you can switch channels with these things is really amazing, right? We do exclamation points with prosody, with our tone of voice.
Okay, that's
right. And sometimes with the arrangement of how we do our grammar, with how we arrange our sentences. What an amazing thing! That's grammatical, and it's also prosodic, right? But in Japanese, prosody is less of a thing, and so what you have is let's say that prosody functions differently. I think that's a fairer way of putting it. And so what you have is you have a little piece of language, yo, that you put at the end of the sentence, and that's your exclamation point. It indicates that you're saying it emphatically. And of course, there is some degree of prosody that goes along with that, right? But you have, yeah. Anyway, it's cool stuff. So I've just typed it into the space bar, so in case you want to Google it.
Yeah.
Prosody.
I'm Googling it now.
Prosody is really interesting because it's auditory and it's concurrent with grammar, and it carries different kinds of information. It's yeah, I mean, language is so complex that when you start digging into all of the different things you could possibly mess around with, there are tons. So I'm going to actually put in a plug for my lesson. I have an on-demand lesson called The Power of Words, Linguistics for Speculative Fiction Writers. And it's up at Kat Rambo's website right now. And it's $29, and it's a month of work for me. And it goes through all of the aspects of linguistics that I've studied that I felt I could be most useful about. Most of them are having to do with auditory language, but again, they don't necessarily have to be. They're just talking about different things that are communicated by different aspects of language. And so check it out if you would like to have an in-depth linguistic look at some of the things that you can do in speculative fiction with language. So I think we're going to call that good for today. and you know, off camera, we will discuss whether we need to come back to aspects of this topic again. Because, man,
It's a topic and a
it's
half.
a big one, right? And boy, it got to, I really love the place we got to with this. So thank you all for being here. Next week, oh my goodness. Next week, let's do dentistry. Haha. Yes,
Up.
I knew it was coming. Teeth and dentistry, okay? That'll be fun. And then at the start of, let's see, well, you know, I think we have a couple more weeks before we have our next guest, because he's coming on November the 9th. But so for now, we'll say see you next week for dentistry, I hope, and I'm going to stop the broadcast.